Recording in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Coming up, which Democratic candidate is most likely to win the Iowa caucus? And for that matter, which one's most likely to win the nomination? Also, what's the probability that Donald Trump will be impeached by the beginning of next year by the House? And how will that impact the election? And what will United States and Chinese tariff or trade relations look like in a year from now? Check it out. This is Political Forecast Weekly. Welcome to Political Forecast Weekly. My name is Ben Todd. With us is a special guest, Sean Nestor. Sean's an activist, well-regarded, and one of the things that you made international news for this past year, and I wanted to get your take on this, was I believe you started a referendum that achieved, for the first time ever, a natural body of something, Great Lake, to receive the legal rights of personhood. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And I know I butchered it there, didn't
That's
I?
okay.
Yeah, you helped get the Lake Erie Bill of Rights passed.
Correct. Thanks for having me on the show, Ben.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to work with you again. So I helped form an organization a few years ago called Toledoans for Safe Water. And this February, we put to Toledo voters the idea of actually granting Lake Erie its own personhood under the law, which comes with a lot of really interesting results as far as how we can handle protecting Lake Erie. But that passed with 61% of the vote. We had a lot of opposition from industry groups, but it's the first law in the United States that officially recognizes a body of water as having rights and would allow that body of water to enter the court system. So it'd be like Lake Erie versus, Poisonous Company in the courts. It wouldn't just be a group of citizens defending it. So that was landmark. We got international news for it. We're fighting to grow the rights of nature movement here in the United States and abroad. And it was definitely one of the finer moments in my activism over the years.
Congratulations. Yeah. That was
Thanks.
Incredible. So I wanted to get your take on a few different topics. And I presented a lot of data points earlier before we started the show. And I want to go over them with all of our listeners. And the first question that we're going to have that we want to talk about is, will the United States be in recession by November of 2020? And obviously, it's a political question. If the economy goes into recession, it makes the incumbent president less likely to win re-election. And there's a lot of evidence that it could. And before we get your take on it, I want to go over some data points that are really fascinating that kind of show both sides of whether it may go into recession or may not. So the first data point is there's been a couple surveys that have been taken. One by the Conference Board the Conference Board Measure of CEO Confidence. It's a well-respected survey, and what they did was they surveyed CEOs. And in the past, it's predicted recessions. And for those of you watching us on YouTube, you can see on the screen. In the gray area, you see recessions happening. And shortly before that, you see CEO confidence in the economy go down. And I think it's a pretty interesting predictor that it's not necessarily saying that we're going to have a recession, but it's saying that many CEOs are less optimistic about the economic future of their company. And the other one is the Duke University CFO Global Business Outlook. And a majority of CFOs also expect a recession to start before the presidential election. 55% of CFOs have actually become more pessimistic compared to the second quarter of this year. And more than half of U.S. CFOs believe that the United States will be in a recession by the third quarter of 2020. I found that really interesting. One of the quotes from the survey says CFOs are frustrated about the not being able to hire workers with skills that are well matched with job openings, and worker shortages are occurring at various levels. I think there is something to that, and I think a lot of that might be self-imposed by the Trump administration, if you think about it, with regards to immigration, making it harder for people who even get their degrees here to get jobs here. And while it might boost skilled workers' salaries in America because there's simply a shortage and they become more valuable, there's definitely a negative impact to companies' financial prospects and their growth prospects by not having enough qualified people to handle those roles. And I was wondering what your take was on that.
Well, I do believe I just sort of live life expecting there fully to be a recession any day now, and probably multiple in the years to come until certain major policy changes are rolled back. For the last many decades, there's been a movement in American politics to essentially make the idea of regulation of anything, this like anathema to what we want to do. And we're starting to see the results of that. I would expect that if you go back to 1999, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which repealed much of what was passed in 1933 as what was known as the Glass-Steagall Act. That move in 1999 removed a number of protections that among other things, it separated investment banks from retail banks. And since then, we've seen banks buying up other banks. There's been consolidation. There's been less competition. And there's also been this movement toward really ramping up Wall Street at the expense of everyone else. One of the manifestations of this is if you're somebody who is a skilled professional and you get tired of working for a large corporation and want to go solo and maybe compete with them or compete for smaller clients, it's harder for you to go out to a retail bank and get a loan for a few $100,000 for you to start your own business. Nowadays, banks, because they're looking at big dollars, they're looking at investment amounts. They're only really interested in if you have $1 million or two at your disposal and that you're going to go for big dollars. Most people aren't in that position. So we've seen the middle class get eroded because they're stuck in these large corporations that keep merging and growing with each other. And along with that come a lot of decimations to benefits, wages, all sorts of things. But all of this is culminating in the fact that we've made a lot of bad policy decisions in the name of being pro-business that earned a lot of people money on the short term, but long term it's created major problems. And this precedes the Trump administration. This goes back to both Democratic and Republican administrations, and it goes back to Congress since at least the 80s.
Let me entertain your assertion. I want to just entertain this thought, and this is something I've been thinking about for a while. So obviously the United States economy, and it's a lot more complicated than I'm going to phrase it, but the economy, the strength of an economy is based off what people do, what they get done. You drive on a road, somebody had to build the road. You go to a building, somebody had to build the building. And so when Americans are constantly working, the economy really is doing well then. The economy is working in full force. Things are getting done, things are getting built, created, invented, so on, that it doesn't hurt it necessarily by having the money go to the top overall, because as long as people are still working, the economic engine is still on. But what happens, though, I think, is it's a psychological problem. People see others that are making so much more than they do, having so much more power and influence than they do. And it causes resentment, it causes greater amounts of crime, and it's economic inequality that people have a problem with. But with regards to lowering salaries, it's not like, or raising salaries of workers that are lowly paid. It's not like raising their salaries would create greater economic gains. It's not like they would increase in productivity. Am I wrong, or is that?
Well, I take a slightly different approach to it. I think, looking at how do you judge a healthy economy? My rule of thumb is this. I look around, and I can go to any city in America today, and I can see that there's a ton of work that needs to be done. I'm from Toledo. The roads are really bad in Toledo. They have been for a long time.
They're worse in Michigan.
Right. And there's all sorts of infrastructure projects that need to get done. There's all sorts of interest in growing and expanding schools. There's all this work that needs to be done. And there's all these people who want to work, and yet the capital isn't moving in such a way that allows people to grow into those roles. Education is traditionally seen as the avenue through which people go from, hey, I want to help do this, to I can do it because I'm being paid to. But those jobs aren't being created. I think that's a missing part of the equation, that with the concentration of wealth in just fewer and fewer hands, the blind spots or the disinterest of those fewer people is resulting in why aren't we putting two and two together? There's jobs that need to be done. There's people who want to do them. Put the money there. Well, it's not going there. The wealthy are really concentrating on a very narrow set of industries. They're ignoring a lot of others, and we're seeing a lot of pain points. Education is a huge sector that we can't ignore, because between higher education, which is completely unsustainably funded at this point with over $1.5 trillion in unpaid student loan debt in this country, and K through 12 largely being gutted, and in the push for charter schools, money is being bled away from public schools, which are resulting in poor performance. It's the income inequality that we see is just the tip of the iceberg. That income inequality is manifesting in splits in the quality of education people are receiving, the kinds of jobs they can get and actually work. And while a few sectors are going well because that's what the wealthy are paying attention to, there's a lot of sectors that are suffering, and it's suffering because Wall Street is not investing in them, or it's attempting to invest in them in very, very narrow ways.
Yeah, okay. I can see that. With that said, though, people, granted, I completely agree, college is tremendously overpriced, but more people are getting degrees than ever before.
Yeah, but are
Americans
they
in
getting
general.
jobs with those degrees?
Well, there's degree inflation now. But, like, as you were saying, though, like, we have become more educated as a society and economy. And while there is this fierce amount of economic inequality, there also seems to be an ample workforce that's getting educated. So sometimes when I see that, I think maybe the U.S. economy isn't in that bad of a place.
Well, I think you have a lot of the pieces are there, but they're not being put together. You do have an educated workforce, but again, the jobs aren't there for them. The jobs aren't being created. I think part of why we see so much rhetoric about job creators is because nobody wants to come to the realization that most of the people with money are not creating jobs. I mean, they're creating some
creating
jobs,
wealth.
but not nearly as much as they should, given the amount of wealth at their disposal. And this is part of what I think, beyond just the obvious physical signs of income inequality, where you go to one part of town and it looks good, and go down the same street and you're in a part of town that looks terrible. I think it's not just the physical stuff like that you see. It's so obvious. It's the reality that there's a gap in how decisions are being made. People aren't having their needs met, and that goes across the board. Almost everybody's unhappy. It's just that most of them are being redirected into saying that they should be unhappy with each other and not the people who actually are capable of making the decisions, which would be people with capital to invest and politicians who have some say in trying to redirect that through policy.
Okay. So I want to get your take on whether there'll be a recession by 2020. But before we do that, I want to get through just the other data points. For the negative parts, or for the signs that there might be a recession, International Monetary Fund lowered its expectations for global growth in 2019 to 3%. And it's the lowest rate since the financial crisis. Globally, all around the world, economies are kind of drifting into recession. It's not official yet. And expectations in the bond market are also a great predictor of recessions. Typically speaking, long-term interest rates tend to be high when investors expect a booming economy in which, like, the Fed will tighten money. And they tend to be low if they expect protracted economic weakness and money can be easy. And right now, as you can see, like, the 10-year bond rates have plunged from more than 3% to 1.75. And the last time it's ever been seen where there's been such a large rate drop was in 2010, 2011. But regarding signs of hope and regarding signs where I think it might not be a done deal in terms of whether the United States will face a recession, I have an argument, and it's kind of speculative, and I want you to pick it apart if it's flawed. But when you look at a lot of the factors that economists say are weighing down the economy, you see issues like the trade war with China, uncertainty around how Brexit will affect global supply chains, worker shortages at various levels. Most of these problems are structural ones, and they're often self-imposed by the American government, the Trump administration. And while that's not good, these aren't as bad as something that's flawed with the business cycle. These aren't unresolvable, and they could easily be resolved if there's political will, and there might be. Worker shortages, for one. The United States allows more educated of a workforce to come into its borders like it had been in the past. That issue can be solved. Tariffs will be solved. Actually, yesterday, the Trump administration came up with a trade agreement with China. The details aren't released yet, but chances are tariffs might actually be lowered. Right now, one interesting statistic I found is as tariffs between the United States and China have gone up, China has been charging less on tariffs for all of the countries. And so it's weakened China's economy. And as a result, I think the United States might actually have a greater bargaining chip when negotiating with China because of the signs of weakness. But overall, it could break 50-50. And I'm thinking, what are your thoughts? Do you think it's a 50-50 chance whether we'll experience recession by 2020 or November of 2020, I'm saying?
It's just tough because honestly, for most of the people I know, we've never not been in a recession. I feel like officially, as far as like what are heralded as the traditional economic indicators of a recession, I think, at any given point, like I said, we're so precarious, we're so vulnerable. It wouldn't surprise me if we enter it tomorrow or we stay in it for a prolonged period of time. But to me, the bigger thing is the fact that many Americans feel like the recession that started in 2008 never really left, that we're still living in an era where, real wages aren't matching up with profits that are being earned, that there's less and less investment in their communities, infrastructure's getting worse, schools aren't necessarily improving. There's all these big issues that aren't being tackled. You could forgive somebody for saying that even though the economy is supposedly healthy, it doesn't really feel that way. And I do think that as far as like how much of this is self-imposed, well, of course it is, but it's been self-imposed since well before the Trump administration. I'm very much in favor of opening borders more and allowing more international movement between people, and that of course includes people coming here for jobs. I'm very much in support of that. But I think you have to ask the question of why is it that we're so eager to import talent from overseas? Why isn't there more of an investment to grow that here at home? Why isn't there more investment in colleges and educations to make this an attractive, maybe a more attractive place for students to come and study internationally? I think that's always something, and maybe make it an inviting place for somebody to maybe move and consider living and building a career here. I think there is a point to, I'm far from a xenophobe, but I do think that there's a point to be made that investment here at home has been ignored for a long time in pursuit of trying to live in this global economy that may or may not benefit America at different times. We do have to take care of people here. We do have to find ways to invest in our own constituents because, of course, we're trying to represent them and trying to make a country and a society that people want to be a part of.
Okay. That's a good point. I guess I look at it from a statistical standpoint, and you're right. I mean, society life isn't the same as it was in pre-2008 recession. But with that said, economies, it's always viewed in a relative scale. If you look at the quality of life in America right now, the average American, statistically speaking, has longer life expectancy, greater access to healthcare, better entertainment options, greater access to education, believe it or not. And these are all positive developments. What comes, I guess, what makes it seem like it's not progressing as much is because I feel like as barriers have broken down over the decades for certain groups of people, certain oftentimes marginalized groups of people, society and the economy has become much more competitive. And that competition has created more instability in the economy for various people. And it's been felt in certain ways. And I'm guessing also, too, you being from Toledo, it's a different atmosphere over there. It's a manufacturing town. It's a union town. And union jobs aren't what they used to be. It doesn't pay well anymore to necessarily work at a factory and be a union worker. And if it does, there's not many of those jobs. And so I could see how, from that vantage point, you'd see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I would contest some of that, though. I mean, there are certainly a lot of things we can point to about the modern era to say this is a point to herald and to hold up as progress. But I'm also seeing some statistics that say, for example, that our generation of people, millennials, our life expectancy is actually starting to dip compared to previous generations.
Really?
Yes.
How can they predict our generation's life expectancy? Because we're dying earlier already?
Health issues. And actually, there's a number of other troubling statistics, including things like record numbers of suicide, which are also, putting aside the economic considerations, we have to look at the sociological statistics here that are saying that life is becoming hard enough that a lot of younger people and even older people are starting to end their lives because they find it so miserable to be here. I can't ignore that kind of information when I'm hearing about it and trying to make that. Life expectancy may be going up for some, but I think for others it's being cut tragically short. And I think it's happening because the conditions are so miserable. Income inequality, as you mentioned, is there are marginalized groups that aren't seeing those benefits. In the Midwest, in a lot of what are colloquially known as Rust Belt towns, certainly we're kind of on the forefront of that. But I think even on the coasts, we're starting to see it too. People are being priced out of New York City and San Francisco. Those places are becoming almost unbearable to live in because they're so expensive. And meanwhile, people are being displaced. They can't find affordable housing. There's a lot of troubling factors that you have to put with the kind of nicer statistics to try to get a sense of what's really going on. So, in light of the recession and is it likely, I would take that what our friends and our CEOs are seeing, I would take that seriously. I would assume that they're onto something, that they are picking up that probably through a confluence of complicated factors. Things are probably not going to be good in the business world in the next few years. Maybe certain sectors will get taken care of, but the pattern will continue where most sectors are actually going to struggle, including manufacturing, including higher education, which is an ailing industry, and education in general. Healthcare, I think, is very precarious right now because of a number of factors, including what I would say is the inherent unsustainability of our private healthcare model. But all these things are connected, and a disease in any one of those sectors is going to impact the others. That's why I think people are picking up. You know what? I think that there's going to be bad times ahead.
Yeah, and I think investors have adjusted accordingly. And right now, statistically, the GM strikes that recently happened, that's definitely affected in the manufacturing sector around the Midwest, and you can see it already.
Right, but what's the attitude of the investors? Is it, of course, I know the answer to this, but do you invest in where you think there might be a few good sectors that'll make profit, or do you invest in where things need to be invested in order to bolster the entire economy? I think part of the problem is we don't have people with capital investing in ailing industries in a way that actually helps those industries stay strong and support the rest of the economy. We've arbitrarily siloed these sectors as though they stand alone and don't have a major impact. When you talk about the workforce not being developed enough, and that's part of why, hey, why don't we go abroad and bring talent here? Again, I'm cool with that. But you have to ask the question, why do we decide that we're going to ignore all the people here who want that?
I agree.
Investors could be putting more into colleges and universities in order to let them be strong, in order to let our workforce develop and improve all of the different sectors that those colleges and universities can help feed. But that requires partnership. It requires long-term thinking. It requires investment in things that right now might not be very profitable. And it requires letting those people in those industries do what they do best without trying to micromanage or interfere or turn them into kind of kitschy enterprises. So to me, I think that's an important point.
Okay. All right. Well, now we covered that. So what do you think? It's 50-50 then?
For a recession, I would say 90 to 10 in favor of probably there's going to be a recession.
Okay.
I think a recession has to happen
You
sooner or
hear,
later.
folks,
and if it's
take
not
your money out of the
2020,
bank.
I am not a financial advisor.
Yeah.
I'm not licensed by the SEC or anybody, but I would say, things are very precarious. And if you're investing, I think it's going to be, it's very difficult waters to navigate.
Okay. Solid. I hope you're wrong, though, because I don't want to go through one. Anyways, though, let's go over to the politics. And the Iowa caucuses are going to happen in, I believe, February 3rd is when the Iowa caucus is. Right now, the top three leaders in the polls, it's really coming down to Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders. Those are the three leaders in Iowa as well. And I was wondering what your take was on it. Who do you think has the best chance at winning Iowa, and who do you think has the best chance at winning the primary?
I'm going to preface this by saying that I generally, as a policy, do not try to participate or observe in any presidential politics until the actual calendar year.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of what they do in other countries, which is they actually have explicit prohibitions against campaigning, except until like 2 or 3 months before the election. We've been talking about the presidential race since, pretty much ever since Donald Trump was elected, and certainly it's escalated tremendously since the 2018 general election. But even as much as I've tried to avoid it, you can't. I have so many people posting on social media. It's all over the news. Everybody wants to know who's going to be the Democratic challenger to Donald Trump. So my observations, one of the few words of wisdom that I picked up a long time ago regarding the presidential primaries is that a month is a very long time. Actually, a week is a very long time, meaning things can change very drastically. And if you actually pay attention to any of the competitive presidential primaries we've had, that will hold true. If you go back and look at who were the front runners at a certain point of time, 18 months before the last presidential primary, there's a fascinating history here. One or two gaffes or one or two things happen, and boom, somebody's out of the race. And they were a front runner for so long, and then where do their supporters go?
Yeah.
Who do they line up with? So obviously, right now, it's kind of focusing a lot on Sanders, Warren, and Biden. And obviously, polls are very controversial with people in all the camps kind of fudging them, and there's always a few percentage points you have to work with. Iowa, I would imagine a strong showing for Bernie Sanders. I think he will show very strongly in the Midwest. I think more so than Warren and Biden, who will come off more as like East Coast, a little more professional, a little more liberal, a little more detached. And I think Sanders is going to really capitalize on much of the same frustration that Trump was able to capitalize on in 2016, which is here in the Midwest, in those quote-unquote Rust Belt towns. People want somebody who's fired up, who's passionate, and who's committed in one way or another to their principles. Sanders is certainly that, and I think he's got a real shot at ultimately winning the nomination.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I could kind of see how he would have a potential shot. I think this sounds petty, but the verb is socialist.
Right.
There's a lot of American opposition to that. And there's a lot of history behind that word, a lot of negative history.
Right, yeah.
And so when he embraces it, I think people might be hesitant to go along. But the person that I think actually has the best chance at beating Donald Trump might be Joe Biden. And here's why. So I was reading recently, CIA.gov has the World Fact Book. Have you ever checked that out?
No.
So it's really interesting. It shows you country profiles, and they break down countries demographically, economically, geographically, and so forth. And when they were describing America's economy, one of the descriptions they used was they said America has a two-tier economy. There's one tier of the economy that is largely unskilled workers inhibit. It doesn't pay as well. And then there's another tier, and the other tier is for highly skilled workers, and the salaries are much more lucrative. And I think, education, while many people get educations and don't make as much money as they would like after receiving them, education really is a differentiator for a lot of people in our economy. If you don't have one, it's very hard for anyone to get ahead. And, there's a majority of Americans don't even have a bachelor's degree, majority of voters for that matter. And so when you have that kind of reality, I think in 2016 when it was Trump versus Hillary, Trump made a great appeal to voters because of the fact that, they've seen their jobs go overseas. He offered at least a solution, whether it was a good solution, whether he was talking honestly or not, that can be debated. But at least he talked about it. At least he brought it into the discussion. As a result, he did really well with those voters. And I see Joe Biden having the similar type of appeal. He has an industrial middle-class background. He has very strong union support. And as a result, I think those are the voters that are going to determine the election. The Midwest is going to determine the election. And I think Joe Biden has the best chance at winning the Midwest. But I don't know. What are your takes?
So, yeah, I think you're right about the Midwest playing a critical role. I think certainly that was true in 2016. When Hillary Clinton failed to take a lot of the Midwest states, that was really it. That was what shocked everybody. And I think, your statements about, Donald Trump appealed to the voters who saw their jobs go overseas. He saw, to the frustrations. You could say the same thing about Sanders. You can disagree with how he might go about doing it, but you have to admit that he's pretty committed to that. Now, Joe Biden has the again, we're talking about, and we can't understate enough that people recognize Donald Trump from TV. He had many years of name recognition, which is big, and I think that's why he was able to become elected president despite never holding elected office before. Now, Joe Biden, on the other hand, is a career politician. I mean, Bernie Sanders is too, but the perception, you have to think about what the base perception of somebody who's not college educated, who doesn't necessarily watch cable news, television every day.
Mhm.
What's their perception of a Joe Biden versus a Bernie Sanders? And I would argue that in the Midwest, you're going to see a lot more support for Bernie Sanders than Joe Biden. Because
Really?
Joe Biden's perception is that he is a career politician. He's too professional. He's too caught up in the machine. He's too caught up in the fact that he's been a Washington insider for decades hurts him.
Mhm.
The fact that Bernie Sanders has been a Washington outsider for decades helps him. I
Mhm.
mean, Sanders is kind of an outsider, kind of an insider,
Well,
but he's been able to get this far by saying the reason things are bad is because nobody's listened to me, and that'll appeal to a lot of people. Joe Biden can say, I was there as vice president for Barack Obama.
mhm.
He could say, I've been in Congress for a long time.
Well,
But that
he-
comes
he
with
can
a
also
lot of
say,
baggage.
I'm a union guy. I support union work. I'll do whatever I can to get union work back. And one of the reasons why I think his case presents a more appealing he presents a more appealing message to voters that are mainly, less skilled workers. I should say unskilled workers.
Blue collar?
Blue collar, yes, blue collar. One of the reasons why I think he has more of an appeal to blue collar workers is because of the fact that, blue collar workers, they don't want just like a handout like everybody else. They want a job. And union people, at least they have the appeal of saying, we'll help you get a job and it'll be a good paying job. And there definitely is an appeal to that. Not saying that Sanders would not be in support of that. Obviously he would. But I think Joe Biden's message resonates more because he's not talking about just expanding the social safety net, but giving people something to do with their lives, giving life purpose. Work gives life purpose. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think he might have the best chance.
I think you're going to find that every Democratic candidate for president has that message. They're all going to say we support unions. They're all going to say that we want to help people get jobs, not just handouts, and they're going to say that. So that's a true up and down. Joe Biden's not unique in that. But what Joe Biden's got to compete with is his support over many years of controversial bills, such as, say, NAFTA, which is going to hurt him when he goes to the union shops and says, I support unions. And they're going to say, tell me about your support for NAFTA. And Bernie Sanders is going to have the credibility to say, I railed against it when it was there. I was right all along, and now we see the proof in the pudding. And that's going to be the kind of commitment, the long-term, long-haul thinking that I think is going to appeal to folks.
Okay.
I think it's part of its optics. Bernie Sanders he comes off very like cranky and old, and he is. But people like that. People kind of like somebody who's ready to kick a little ass. Joe Biden comes off a little more slick, a little more practiced, and people are kind of distrustful of that at this point. The federal government has not done a good job for the Midwest. They have not done a good job for blue-collar workers. And again, if you're a Washington insider, questions have to come up about how much can we really trust you. A Washington outsider has a better chance, and I think we can't forget that that's part of the wave that Donald Trump rode, is the disaffected blue-collar folks who are tired of hearing the same song and dance. Of course, every Democrat says they support unions, but the evidence hasn't followed that. And that's true. And Republicans have been able to make political hay out of it. And I think Sanders can do the same, but in a different direction, more leftward rather than a rightward direction.
Okay. So I take it, you cannot give your support yet, can you?
Well,
as to who you support? Are you
I'm
on
not
Sanders?
necessarily supporting the Democrat for president inherently. I'm going to see what the options are. I'm not somebody who says that anybody but Trump. Trump is disastrous. He's the worst president in our lifetime, and certainly I think he's probably the worst president in American history. He should be impeached. I can go on for a long time about everything I hate about him. That being said, I'm never going to stoop to the point of selling my vote out to just, anybody but the worst, because I think that at this point, I'm saying that my vote isn't about what I want. It's about trying to avoid the worst case situation, in which case I'm basically admitting that voting in America is just about kind of being held hostage by the political process. I refuse to become a victim like that. That being said, I have a history of supporting independents, minor party candidates for president. I voted for Jill Stein in both 2012 and 2016. I voted for Ralph Nader in 2008. In fact, I voted for John Kerry in 2004, but only because the Democrats kept Ralph Nader off the ballot in Ohio at that stage. So I'm open to supporting a Green Party candidate again in 2020. If the Democrats don't nominate somebody like Sanders, who I think is going to be really serious about changing these issues, and I do believe Sanders is the only person at this stage I would consider voting for for president if he wins the Democratic nomination. If not, I am likely to go third party or independent again.
Okay. That's solid. All right. Well, thank you for being on. I'm about to do our editorial.
Okay.
And yes, afterwards, I'll get your thoughts.
Okay.
So,
Thanks, Ben.
It's my pleasure. So anyways, now it's time for the editorial. This is an editorial I've written recently. And it's about United States and Chinese relations. So at a recent Democratic debate, candidates were asked how they would go about handling U.S.-China relations. In the responses, nearly every candidate agreed that they would attempt to lower tariffs and end the trade war. But is this a solid policy? Is a rising China good for American interests? Much of the debate around imposing heavy tariffs on China stems from a larger one regarding free trade. For decades, economists have argued that free trade offers America a competitive advantage or comparative advantage, that globalization should be looked at as almost an Americanization of the world, that bringing about prosperity, or that globalization brings about prosperity to everyone involved. And while this is true, as Americans do have access to more goods and cheaper prices than they otherwise would have, is this comparative advantage worth the alternatives? My apologies. This gave out on me. Oh, there we go. But is our comparative advantage stemming from free trade worth its benefits if our trading partners benefit exponentially more? What if these partners benefiting from it overtake us as the most powerful nation in the world? Also, what if these partners use their influence to advance their ideology, an ideology that may be opposed to ours? This year, the National Basketball Association's revenues from China will make up over 6% of overall revenue throughout the league. Last month, amidst protests in Hong Kong, Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey, exercising his own freedom of speech, tweeted a photo in solidarity for the protesters in Hong Kong. This resulted in an infuriated Chinese government pulling sponsorships, refusing to broadcast preseason games, and requesting that the NBA fire Morey for his tweet. While the NBA did not do so, they did have LeBron James, probably their foremost superstar, deliver a speech that was critical of Morey's comments. Now, while this isn't the end of the world, I think this situation represents potential circumstances that America may be faced with even more. We no longer have the world's largest economy. China does. Now, a rising China wouldn't be as big of a dilemma if they shared similar laws and values as we do in the West, but they don't. While China's greatest exports is cheap labor, America's greatest export is intellectual property, and China's been devaluing their currency and stealing our intellectual property for decades. In March, in fact, CNBC published a survey which said that 1 out of every 5 corporations have had some sort of intellectual property theft from China in the past year. While this has been happening, Democratic presidential candidates have been lambasting Trump's trade policy. While the Trump tariffs may have some negative domestic impacts, you must say it's been effective in curtailing China's economic growth. And I believe it should at least play a prominent role in our national debate as to whether to continue them. So my suggestion to Democratic candidates is that before disagreeing with Trump's tariff policies and saying that we should completely reverse course, that maybe they should also come up with alternatives of their own. So anyways, this is our first podcast. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when it comes to global trade, China is always like kind of this boogeyman in the United States, but it's hard. Honestly, I'm not really impressed by the economic policies of China or the United States. I think they've both been tremendously abusive toward workers. And obviously, the idea that, a rising tide floats all boats, but we've seen over and over that wealth is getting concentrated at the top and others are suffering. I think that lack of inclusion of people in the economic processes is resulting in huge underclasses, both in China and in the United States, that are really upset with their governments. And we don't hear about them as much. We get brought into the dog and pony show of how, what does Wall Street in America say about what the premier of China is doing. Well, I don't care. I don't care for any of them. I'm a little bit more. I guess I come from that like more populist angle of all of the. I think workers all over the world and poor people all over the world are definitely getting the worst end of the stick, and they aren't getting representation. I think that tariffs are a very controversial thing in economics. I'm generally not in favor of them, but I understand how they get wielded and why. I just feel like a lot of times what's getting lost in that whole debate is, well, what's China doing about its environmental policies that are really polluting a lot of people and dealing with a lot of health crises over there? The intellectual property matter, I mean, we have a lot of things to tackle about intellectual property here in the West, particularly when it comes to software. There's a lot of really ridiculous ideas about the scope of intellectual property that we haven't grappled with yet. So it's hard to really shake a finger at China for, bootlegging DVDs or whatnot that people are worried about. So,
Well, it's draining our capital, though. And, we're not being compensated for that.
well, who's we? Wall Street or the actual
I
workers?
mean, the American economy,
because
there's
it's Wall Street.
multipliers that go about it. And the closer proximity you are to a multiplier, the greater you are,
But there's
the
fewer
greater
and-
the likelihood that you're going to experience some effects from it.
But there's fewer and fewer people who are close to those multipliers, as you put it. And I think that's the problem. And I think China's having that problem too. For a country that's ostensibly communist or socialist, I think they're ridiculously oppressive of their people. And, the Hong Kong protests are, kind of an interesting situation. I'm not a big fan of the Chinese government. I think they're totalitarian and controlling. And it's really absurd. It's offensive, really, to see them come and make demands of American enterprise. But this is what the pursuit of global capitalism essentially provides you. It's this weird interference of countries in each other's affairs on economic grounds. And if you're offended by the Chinese government making demands on the NBA, think about all the times that American governments have gone in and overthrown smaller governments.
Yeah, and we do. But
to try to get capital.
This is what I find kind of interesting, though. In most cases, like when a country like China commits a human rights violation, we implement sanctions, there's outrage. And I almost feel like things could be reversing course. And I don't believe the Chinese government, they don't share the same values as us. There was a recent meeting of Chinese communist leaders this past week and President Xi Jinping. And, China has a lot going on. They have the Hong Kong protests. Economic growth is at its lowest point since the 1990s. And there's turmoil within President Xi Jinping's own administration, it appears. And the number one thing he focused on, the first thing he focused on the first day, which is considered the most important day of any kind of summit, is unity within the party. And I thought, unity within the party, that's not a similar value as an American value.
Is it?
Look
at how many Republicans were critical of Trump, and yet how many of them have stepped up in the last 2 years to defend him.
But Trump doesn't have all of the control like this guy does.
Well,
and I find that very problematic. I mean,
he's been able to get away with a lot.
Have you listened to the news? People are lambasting Trump all the time.
But he's still in power, freely. And he's doing blatantly things. He's like getting his children.
Limits to his power.
Are there? Because he's testing them, and
he's testing them, but he hasn't.
Right. If the impeachment does not happen, if he's kept in power and he's allowed, and it sends the message that he's allowed to blatantly violate laws against emoluments, blatantly violate ethics standards when it comes to being transparent about his possible tax evasions. He keeps giving his children positions they are woefully unqualified for, in a blatant show of nepotism. And if we defend that, which Republicans are lining up to do, and if we keep Republicans in power after with that, then I would say we're no different from a Chinese government with a communist party that needs to be unified under a strong leader. And I'll say this. The idea that we are opposed to China because of human rights violations is wrong. We're opposed to China because they're an economic competitor. The economic powerhouses that have way worse human rights violations, like, say, Turkey or Israel or Saudi Arabia, we love them. And Saudi Arabia does incredibly disgusting things.
They're not a threat to influence global society. And I do believe in democracy. That's not something that is preached in China.
It's certainly not practiced in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but they're not influencing the rest of the world. They're not influencing our corporations the same way. They don't have the same impact.
I think they do. I mean, especially when you consider OPEC and Saudi Arabia's influence in the oil and gas sectors, which are incredible political powerhouses in the United States and abroad. I mean, I just disagree. I know that the common idea is that China's an enemy because they're human rights violations, but human rights violations only get brought up to people who are an economic threat to us. People that are our economic friends that commit human rights violations, we make excuses for and we downplay. Everything with a journalist that was murdered by the Saudi crown, that's disgusting, but we're going to sweep it under the rug, and nothing really substantial has happened. There's been a lot of outrage and some token nods, and that has always been our policy going back for at least 100 years in the United States. We make excuses for our friends, and we hold our enemies, we put them under a microscope and highlight all of the things, but we're hypocrites. We've been inconsistent in the application of our values, including the embrace of democracy, which Saudi Arabia is one of the worst offenders for democracy in the world. And people are afraid to say that because they're very powerful. They can obviously get away with murdering American citizens that publish things that are critical of them, and our government has stood by. So things like that are unforgivable to me, and that's part of why I don't trust the federal government in the United States any more than I would trust the federal government of China.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, we are out of time, Sean. Thank you so much for being on. That way to end it.
I didn't mean to go all like crazy,
No,
with
thanks
that,
for
but-
being on. My name is Ben Todd. This is Political Forecast Weekly. We will be with you next week. Special thanks to our guest, Sean Nestor, and see you later.
Thanks.